Um, Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's actually the threat of European Enlightenment. It's like a treat, but it's not a treat for people. It's a threat. It's what I want to argue. And I don't have any. I don't have a PowerPoint because I don't. It's all very theoretical. But that's good because I also have Ayumi, who was mentioned I think yesterday. Who talks about how the West privileges the visual and how other cultures privilege the auditory. So that is going to be my excuse for why I didn't make that one presentation. And I also wanted to link it to the last presentation of yesterday because there was kind of talk about this kind of constant Armageddon, which I think is true. I think political thought and philosophical thought tends to have in the West, maybe more generally, this kind of idea that like the coming crisis is imminent and this is the last moment that's going to end us all. And you know, you can see it in like the kind of titles of like very famous books, which are like called like Empire, which is Carta Negri, and The End of History, and the Armor and stuff like that. So I'm kind of trying to counteract that kind of logic by saying, yeah, which you know, you can kind of do with certainly some like indigenous thought and certainly like other kinds of modes of thinking. And this thesis is, or like this dissertation thesis is like addressed for me to kind of other academics, to people who are trying to kind of fight the cause in academia. This is like the allies to say, the kind of, broadly, because academia does tend to be quite left-wing, especially in Germany, this kind of like climate change activists, the left-wing kind of human rights activists, this kind of thing. This is kind of who I'm addressing in this. But what I'm arguing is fundamentally the European Enlightenment thinking, which is kind of the basis for all of our knowledge, especially in the university, especially in the academy, is inherently threatening to other modes of thinking, and not in a we take it and use it in a threatening way. Like, no, the very basis of how we think is threatening, because it is we've become to this place of enlightenment modernity where nothing is beyond critical examination. Everything, including the most sacred, has to be observed, verified, and interrogated. And this is the arrogance of modernity, particularly the hyper-modernity of the West. So what I'm arguing is the other spaces, like other places of knowledge, will provide alternative ways to kind of go against the kind of dominant global order. But for that to be realized, we have to be mindful of how our knowledge is inherently. So I take as a theoretical basis for the start of it Horkheimer and Adorno's concept of the dialectic of the Enlightenment, which I took just because I thought it was a good text. So Horkheimer and Adorno were two German Jewish sociologists who left Germany, one in 1933 saying, I know where this is going to go, and one in 1939 and was like, wow, it did go that way. And they both immigrated to the States, and in 1944, this was first published, and then again, they kind of copied that one. They wrote the Dialectic of the Enlightenment that said the Holocaust was not the work of sort of mad, non-humans, which is kind of how we characterize the Nazis to this day. But no, this was the direct outcome of the way we were thinking in Europe. And if it wasn't going to happen in Germany, it would have happened elsewhere. Now, there are a lot of studies, a lot of sociological reasons why it happened in Germany and not in another country, for sure, which I would accept. But they were saying basically, this is Enlightenment thinking. Enlightenment thinking destroys everything that is beautiful, everything that is kind of artistic, and killing human beings by the most efficient means possible was the final crux of capitalism in the end. So they said what they're trying to warn against is saying, don't say the Nazis are just these strange and mad non-humans. It was just a bunch of crazy people who went a bit crazy for a bit of time. And Horkheimer has, I thought, quite a quote was the lesson to be learned from fascism and even more from Bolshevism. So what seems like madness to a detached analysis is at times the reality. The politics, as Hitler said, is not the art of the possible, but of the impossible. So we need to kind of understand that, that it was a natural outcome of these systems. And I think that kind of thesis is quite interesting, and then becomes quite problematic if we're going to then, because what we've done is save the Enlightenment way of thinking in Europe. We saved it by saying these people are crazy. It's not the way we think here. It's not this like super hyper rational way of thinking. We've saved it. And now we export it to other places. Is basically my point. So so what I then go into is try and like look at this kind of hyper, like everything must be reason and rationality, especially in the academy here, which is like everything must stand up to like a good logical argument. Oh, this is the way we do all our papers. It's like argue it or debate it, and at the end, it doesn't become a game of like who has got the most like salient or interesting point. It becomes a game of who is still standing. And I think I was at a talk on intersectionality recently, and I think that has really, and they kind of brought this up, it has a really interesting issue, especially for people who are often, I don't like this term particularly, but minorities or marginalized people in the academy, because it's how long can you keep fighting the fight of saying, this is like my fight, this is my truth, this is my logic, when people keep saying, no, and it's a game of strength. And that actually is not the best way to, I would argue personally, to gain like the most interesting amounts of knowledge and whatever. But that's what it is, because this is Enlightenment thinking. It's like this, nothing cannot be explained if we don't look at it closely, if we don't shine the light on it, if we don't debate it long enough. Like this is, and of course it like naturally ties in with like, the rise of democracy in Europe and whatever. But I think this is highly problematic. And so what I kind of then go into is to try and situate Enlightenment thinking in a kind of sociology of knowledge framework, which is quite problematic because Horkheimer and Adorno and then the sociology of knowledge were not friends. But I decided I'm trying to sort of say that if we understand from a sociology of knowledge point of view, that it's not an inherent discipline. Because I think firstly, we also take Enlightenment thinking in Europe, that's to be an inherent discipline. I want to say sometimes I use Europe when I mean the West in general, because it's like it was born out of Europe. And Europe is fundamentally a peninsula on the end of Asia. We're the only peninsula in the world that ever got the status of the continent. So I don't have any issue using Europe to also kind of mean the West. But yeah, I think to sort of situate it, to recognize it's not an inherent discipline, that other ways of thinking are possible. And then the sociology of knowledge fundamentally tries to argue that, you know, there isn't anything inherent, and we should just say, this is the way we do it. Like, this is the way we do it here. So that's what I try to argue. And then I sort of bring in ideas of like ideology. So it's like because I think it's a really powerful image, this Enlightenment image, which is the imagined liberal Western free individual seen as universal, but it is deeply constituted, as we all are. So this is actually an example from when I was studying university in India. My lecturer said, like, the Europeans came, well, the British came, and they couldn't understand the logic of the Indian worker that would, like, basically work for a bit, then would, like, leave the job and go home and spend all his money, like, on the wedding or drinking or whatever. Like, that to them is completely irrational. But they were like, no, but that's why the Indian works. He just does it for this thing. And that was a fun class, because I kind of make a joke about how for British people we still find like Indian people are rational. Like in India, the culture is often doesn't make sense to me, but it's making sense to someone else, and I need to accept that. So like, yeah, these things are all constituted, and just because we do it our way doesn't mean it necessarily better. Then I argue that history and education are sort of two of the ways in which we entrench the ideals of our societies. Especially history, I think, is very important from a nationalist model to entrench ideas of what our society means, and what values we're going to be carrying forward, especially So like the examples I use, I take from India, like the logic of Indian history is Indian history as it's taught in the school as a curriculum, ends in 1947. Like, that's it, independence is done. Sadness because of the break of Pakistan. Pakistani history, on the other hand, starts in 1947, basically. It begins there. It's like, now we are free, now this is our thing, now this is, the beginning of our nation, because that's when Pakistan was born. And that's completely decided upon because of what is useful for the state of those two countries. And so, like, there is no, like, non-biased level history is my argument. And then there's also a nice example of, like, this, we often say the term Judeo-Christian in the West, and it's become a really, like, normalized thing. But this didn't come about until after World War II, and it was created by the US like military and establishment to make a strategic alliance with Israel, to say there is something that is common between Jewish people and Christian people. But Judeo-Christian, prior to that, the term wasn't used. So I do think it's important to understand how we give legitimacy to certain, like, economic, social ideologies through history and education. And then I think we use science as a kind of way of backing this up, of saying, like, science is the thing that justifies using these things in this way. Yeah, basically. And then I have a couple of anecdotes from being in India, because I think a lot of this was based on my experience of studying a degree that meant I spent a long time in India, but traveled with a lot of like white people, basically, but yeah, like Westerners and a lot of Germans especially, who have like a very fixed idea of how things should be. And my experience of traveling and realizing I traveled the world very differently, but there was like a kind of point where this critique of the university in India that we were at, they were saying JNU, the university, is not, so critical. It's not good social sciences, because they preference this kind of forward-facing lecture, which is actually something we do in Britain, and actually part of the reason why JNU probably does it is because their education system is what like British education. But for Germans, which is like a lot of classroom discussion, that's how they do their lectures. This was like considered not critical. And I was like, but it's not, well, it's not for you, so it doesn't matter. But it's also like, for Indian students who jump through so many hoops to get to university in the first place, there is so many different issues between caste and wealth disparity and religion and whatever, that if you made a system where it was like classroom discussions, it would inherently become only certain voices you would hear in those classrooms, which it does in Germany as well, to be fair. So apparently that's not a problem. But yeah, so I just was like, this kind of bringing ideas about where you come from to a place and then criticizing that place and not recognizing that this is like a completely contextual thing. That was basically where this impetus came to do this. Yeah, so that kind of leads me on to my next bit, which is critical thought in the global south. And then I have a really good quote from someone called Alvarez, which was the vandalism of the conquistadors who melted down the Indians' priceless and exquisitely fashioned gold and silver works of art, convert them into money. It's repeated by scholars on the level of ideas, and the latter submit non-Western phenomena to the criteria of their own. And I thought that was quite a good way of describing our interaction with the other. So then I sort of am trying to construct certain ideas about why this has happened, or like how Europe has done this. And I began with race, because to say that there was always existence of race is like race has like changed throughout history with like certain meanings. So for the Spanish and Portuguese, when it was their time to colonize, race very much was this idea of in the blood. Like race was about mixing the blood, which is why there was a lot of mixing with the natives, because it would, to them, they could dilute the race out of people, and that wasn't a problem. By the time we get to sort of French and, I mean, more British colonization, for the British, they really, mixing was not a thing you did, and it was basically a Puritan Protestant thing. But it's quite interesting because sometimes I quite enjoy reading texts in India written by Indian academics. And there was one I read where the line was literally like, thank God we were colonized by the British and not the French or the Portuguese and their promiscuous ways. And I was like, no one has ever academically thanked the British for being prudes, basically. But this is the thing, there's a reason why self-populations of British colonial rule have remained relatively intact, and because the British fundamentally were not so into the mixing as the way of Spanish. But that is 100% to do with our well, not 100%, but a lot, significantly to do with our constructions of how we construct race, which is this movement from blood to skin color, and what becomes useful for any empire at a given time. And obviously skin color became super useful when it came to the transatlantic slave trade and so on. The second point I bring up in this part, which is knowledge and scholarship, was this kind of the scholar Chen said, if we have been doing Asian studies, Europeans, North Americans, Latin Americans, and Africans have also been in studies in relation to their own living spaces. That is, Martin Heidegger was actually doing European studies, as was Foucault, as was Bourdieu, as was Habermas. European experiences were their system of reference. Once we recognize how extremely limited the current conditions of knowledge are, we learn to be humble about knowledge claims. So it's this idea that anything that's produced in Europe gets termed philosophy, especially because of the way academia and university education is structured in the world. We have a monopoly, or we have a hegemony on the claims of what is legitimate knowledge. And I would like to argue that that's not true, basically. And so everyone has basically been doing their own knowledge. It's just that if we come from a European-derived place, we don't have to claim that it's a regional studies. But it is just as regional studies because there is no knowledge. It's not separate from the space, which is kind of why I wanted to bring the position of knowledge into it. And then I talk a little bit about how other knowledges then end up subsumed underneath the term religion, which I think happens a lot in India, because a lot of Indian philosophy is tied in with Buddhist and Muslim scholars and so on. And because it's these people that went to go do it, they say, oh no, this is not real academic philosophy. This is religion, but it is philosophy. It's highly in the terms of even European Enlightenment thinking, it would be considered highly rationalistic, highly well thought out, highly structured. So my argument is that it ends up being put in a category of religion, and then it means that the West doesn't deal with it properly or question any of its kind of logic of it. And I just think it happens all the time, and I kind of noted and reflected an example of myself. For instance, that India has a 5.5-hour time difference from Greenwich Mean Time. And it was a kind of rumor that then got to be considered true, that this was because India doesn't want the same time zone as Pakistan. So Pakistan's on 5 hours from Greenwich Mean Time and India's on 5.5. And then I read some Amartya Sen, and it was no, it's a close approximation of the ancient city of Ujjain, which is still a reference point for many of India's calendars, and that's actually the reason why it's this amount of time. And it's that arrogance of assuming the basis must still be, Greenwich Mean Time, must be Euro. And then they've chosen something else, and it's no, it's just completely separately not related to this at all. And so I'm going to just withhold why Nepal has a time difference of 5 hours and 45 minutes for Greenwich Mean Time. I don't know why that is. Maybe one day I will find out. Another point I brought up, which I think came up a lot yesterday as well, I think it's super important, was language. Because the means of communicating between languages that often have terms that are not directly translatable is I think a really important point is how then do you go to the other and represent the other if you don't have the language? When language carries inherent regulations or norms in it, and it changes it. And I think it's interesting because I took also a kind of example from within India, because this isn't just a problem of language from a global south language or to a European language. it's a problem even for Indians. So like, there's now like a lot of work of like Dalit, which is the lower caste, like the lowest caste text, being translated into English because they want these stories to be told about what these people, how their lives are. But the inclination when they're translating them is also to Sanskritize them, which is to kind of make them more of like the Indian upper class text. So these exist within nations. It's not always, my point is, it's not just always an interaction between global South and the West, it's also, you know, within cultures that there is a problem. And yeah, but basically there's a kind of power that comes, I think, from language, and there's a lot of talk about, as well, writing being very different to speaking inevitably, but like what that means for people, which I don't have. I'm not a linguist, and I'm also horrible at languages, so I don't go into that too much. I would care about that. And then finally, what I present is some alternatives. The first one I put is postcolonialism. I tend to preference the term postcolonialism over decolonialism, not just because like decoloniality has become such a buzzword now in universities, where I don't know how many times people keep saying we're like having a decolonial moment, and I don't know what it means other than there's going to be lots of talks about how great we are and what we're doing, and nothing really happened. But also because Indian scholarship tends to prioritize the term post-colonialism, which I like, because I think there's something in the Indian culture which has this idea of like absorbing things and then using it to further themselves. There is, I think, in the same book where they mentioned how frigid the British were, they were talking about how they chose the British as the next rulers of India after the move was to take India forward. And I think you can look at things from two perspectives. You can say, oh no, it was the British, but you can also see there were other colonial options, and India did have a say in it. And I think I like post-colonialism because I think it's more honest. I don't buy into the idea that you can strip back something that was super violent that went on for hundreds and hundreds of years, but you can get past it. I think you can definitely get past it. You can't strip it back. So yeah, so that's what I would say is like the first difference is like using post-colonialism instead. And because, yeah, you're not, and I think there's a kind of decoloniality, which Mignola, which talks a lot about, which is like understand when we are here kind of in our like high horse being like, oh, climate change, that for like a lot of people in the world, they already had this idea of how they were going to interact with the Earth, which was nothing to do with being needed to tell the scientists and statistics about sea level rising, because they already weren't being like cutting down all the trees and burning stuff, so it was fine. Yeah, then I give another option for an alternative way of knowing the other, which is basically what the physics. If European Enlightenment thinking is super violent, as I say. The other one is like a kind of cosmopolitanism, a confluence, like understand that we've always mixed, understand that knowledge has always been like a mixture of like different places. I thought there was like a nice thing with like Kipling's words that are above centre court in Wimbledon, which is if you meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two apostles just the same, are actually words from the Bhagavad Gita, which is one unwisely moved by circumstance, indifferent equally to elation and grief. And I just think, like, understand that we've always been mixing, understand we've always been together, and that our knowledge isn't like just one place. And then the final option I give for another way of being with another is friendship, which I think sounds, I know that it doesn't sound nice in the academic setting, but like Tagore, this very famous Indian poet, talked a lot about how he struggled with British colonization, but one of his best friends was British. And you can make friends. And I also bring in Audre Lorde because I think she's got a really nice bit about like how we don't have to use our differences as ways to separate us, but use our differences to spark more further debate, because you can really like build on like the differences and to make a friendship after. I think that's the entire. Thank you very much. Bye.